Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion, which, building on the theme of Smarter Working Week, will explore how we can adopt a smart approach to ESG. My name's Kate Fergusson. I'm Head of Responsible Business at Irwin Mitchell, and I've been asked to moderate the session today. I am delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of speakers. I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves. So I'll come to Richard first, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Tyler. I'm Director of Legal at Britvic plc, covering supply chain and procurement matters.
And then to Sheena.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sheena Singler. I'm at Logicor. I'm the General Counsel and the Head of ESG.
And to Judith.
Morning, everybody. I'm Judith Worrell. I'm Senior Legal Counsel at Severn Trent plc.
Thanks, everyone. So we have 45 minutes scheduled for today's discussion. I'm sure that's going to go by very quickly. We will, of course, try to fit in any questions that you would like to ask the panel. So please do that via the Q&A function, and we will make some time at the end of the session to answer as many questions as we can. So I suppose to go back to the original objectives of the session and to frame it, implementing a robust ESG strategy is arguably essential for businesses in 2022, and in-house legal teams have a significant influence over how we approach ESG strategy. In the introduction to Smarter Working Week, Catherine Griffiths talks about building on the disruptive creativity of 2020 and creating tangible improvements for our businesses. We've all heard the phrase building back better, and we've heard that in various different contexts. I think the idea that we can learn from the impact of the pandemic has really huge significance in terms of environmental, social, governance issues. So delivering on ESG might sometimes be seen as additional to lawyers' BAU. And the new processes and the administration which is involved can often be time consuming. So the session today is going to look at how lawyers can approach ESG issues and do that in a smart way, balancing the priorities with their existing responsibilities. So going back to one of the comments that we've just made, do you agree that responsible business or ESG is additional to lawyers' BAU, or is it in fact becoming BAU? What's the role of general counsel in ESG? And Sheena, I'm going to come to you first on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Well, in my view, ESG isn't actually very new. I mean, we talk about ESG a lot. And actually, if you talk to people outside of the corporate investor world, people still ask, what is ESG? But actually, if you talk about what it means and break it down into its elements, it's not new. It's about thinking about our environment, sustainability, D&I, employees, well-being, engaging with your community. I think businesses have been doing that always. The difference is that there is a very much enhanced focus on it, and it has become a thing in itself. And so as a result of that, there is a lot more focus. There's a lot more legislation. So you really have to understand it holistically, much more in a business. So for the GC, I believe that you just have to think about and understand how your company is approaching ESG, and therefore you can understand how to manage the risks around the strategy and implementation of that, which happens throughout the organization, just like you would in any other area, whether it's compliance with laws, keeping up to date with changes in laws, understanding how your business is disclosing things, updating investors, reporting, and actually the approach that they're taking, whether it's managing your risk in the way the business wants to do so.
Thanks, Sheena. And then Richard, I'll come to you next, if that's okay.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think this is not a totally new concept, as Sheena said, and it's certainly not BAU. It's certainly not. It's more than just BAU now. So previously, I think people would often see this as extracurricular, and they would be something. There'd be a few people accountable. They would do it on the side. And it wasn't really part of the agenda of the business, whereas the increased focus that Sheena mentioned has really changed that. One of the things that I've noticed, particularly in our business, is there's not really one person that's focused on it. It is the entire business that has ESG as a key part of the role that they're doing. Lots of performance targets are based on that, and so it really runs through everyone's role as a BAU now. And so I think for me that's the biggest change. And then as to the GC's role in that, I think it's really a case of leveraging the unique position that GCs have. We're able to see a lot more than other areas of the business, and particularly connect a lot of different areas.
Thanks, Richard. Judith?
Thanks, Kate. And just building on what Richard and Sheena said, I think at Severn Trent we see ESG as very much part of our everyday work now, and a key point for us is communicating well with our stakeholders, whether those be our customers, our investors, or our regulators. Very much we are wishing to publish our ambitions and our initiatives and setting that out within our governance frameworks. So we very much want to be transparent about it. And so whilst we do see it as very much intrinsic to what we do at Severn Trent, we are very keen to ensure that everyone understands our strategic direction and where we're going. Our General Counsel, Brendan Kennedy, plays a key part, sitting on the board as General Counsel and Company Secretary within our governance framework for ESG.
Thanks, everyone. So some really interesting points there. And from my perspective, leading a responsible business team within Irwin Mitchell, I think I've seen the really powerful and unique role that General Counsel can play, and kind of going beyond governance really in terms of the support that and the collaboration that has to take place. So yeah, some really interesting points, and I really like that point about how responsible business, ESG, it has to become part of everybody's responsibility within an organization in order for us to make an impact, and the impact that we all want to make through this work. So thank you. Building on some of the comments that you've just made, really, how does the legal function align with ESG strategy in your organizations? And Judith, I'll come to you first on that, if that's okay.
Yes, I think I've heard in the past legal teams say, and I have some sympathy that it's ESG seems to be done somewhere else in the business, and the legal teams don't know how to help, feel slightly distant from it, and almost dare you might say that it's being done to the legal teams, and so we're being taken along. At Severn Trent, we've not got that mindset. I always use the principle that if the business wants to drive something forward, it's up to us to get involved and go out there and have those conversations. And certainly we have some key initiatives ongoing at the moment at Severn Trent, one of them being a supporter of the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham this year, and very much part of it, and building 72 tiny forests across the country to support that along with our other stakeholders. In the end, from my perspective, the legal team could very much get involved in delivering against those initiatives. So to deliver tiny forests, we need the land, we need to have the agreements, and we play a key part. And I'd love to think that legal are behind everything, because we can play a really strong role. And I've encouraged our team to very much get involved and really understand it, both from a legal perspective, but also from a project delivery perspective, going a little bit beyond what we lawyers generally would do, and actually being part of the project and program management, and creating, ideas for the teams and some watch outs that might impede delivery in the end. So really, I know that ESG can look very shiny and slick when you publish it, but behind the scenes, I think the lawyers can play that key role for that lovely analogy of the swan gliding along the water, but actually there's quite a lot of paddling going on underneath, which is the lawyers really supporting their business colleagues to deliver these initiatives.
Thanks, Judith. And I love that analogy, because, when you're delivering ESG projects, initiatives, when you're delivering your ESG strategy, you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of work. And I think that's, one of the areas is definitely, where General Counsel come in and can play a key role in that. So thank you. That's a great example. Okay, so Sheena, coming to you next.
Yeah, sure. So I think Richard and Judith have both said this, but legal has a very unique role in businesses, and it sees and deals with every sort of function and department in some respect. Especially as a general counsel, you do see everything, and therefore legal is behind everything. And so what I think is important is that legal teams understand what ESG means for their business. And why I say that with such emphasis is because I have a unique position because I'm the head of ESG as well as the general counsel. But I realise as my legal team is kind of tasked with things to do, they are all related to ESG in some way, or there are different strands of ESG that come to them, which they may not understand are part of that overall ESG strategy. And so actually the general counsel has a role to play in educating its own legal team about what that strategy is and the role that legal can play in it. So whether it's reviewing contracts, understanding legislation and frameworks that the business is applying to its data, thinking about how you engage with your suppliers and your customers, what that means, getting consents of customers and data protection, using the data that you might have, that you might be collecting. There are all sorts of threads where legal really plays a part. But the key is, rather than looking at it as sort of the individual tasks, it's understanding it as a whole. And actually, I think the legal team will then not also deliver better, but also enjoy it better, because I think ultimately we're all interested in these topics, whether it is, saving the planet, using, recycling plastic, finding new materials. There's a lot of areas of innovation here, and we play a part in that as well.
Thanks, Sheena. Richard, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, of course. I completely agree with the comments that have just come before me. I think the only thing I'd add is it's about general counsels and legal teams in general using the position we've got to hold a business to the strategy that is created. And that's something that I view as quite a key part of a legal function for all types of strategy, and ESG in most businesses now intrudes it within that strategy. And there's a few key ways that we're in quite privileged positions to be able to do that. So one in particular is where general counsels are, particularly when they also act as company secretary, there's quite a lot of control of the agenda, particularly around board meetings and exec meetings. And one of the things that we do at Britvic actually is our general counsel will be really involved in setting the agenda for a board meeting along with the chair and the CEO and the rest of the board. And we actually split the time in those board meetings against what we call internally people, performance and planet, which is our way of dividing up ESG. And we actually have a dashboard which we can look back over board meetings throughout the year to understand how much time has been spent on each matter. So it's not all just on performance, for example. So that's a really good way that the legal function can really steer the agenda to make sure that the business is actually meeting the strategy it's set out.
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, it's such a good point, isn't it? Because in my experience, in terms of any of the work that we do around ESG, whether it's diversity and inclusion or community social impact or our environmental management and climate change work, it absolutely has to be seen at board level. It has to be led at board level. There has to be that sponsorship at a very senior leadership exec level of an organisation in order for any of it to kind of become part of business as usual and for the strategy to really be embedded and everyone to play a part. So I think getting that right at board level is absolutely key. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that's challenging, particularly in times like we've had over the last few years, is keeping it on the agenda. Yes. And so as times are tough, I think businesses can quite naturally revert back into day-to-day performance. And I think that's a key part of our role, is actually pushing them back to the strategy and keeping that going.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. And I think that leads us quite nicely to our next question. So I'll ask you to continue with that theme, Richard. How can we ensure the right people are doing the right tasks around ESG? Do you think there's a danger of duplication and disconnect, I guess, if we don't get the governance structures right?
Yes, I think so. Again, that comes back to the unique position of a general counsel, having that oversight of the whole business, which is quite often the job of a legal function, is connect the dots of different areas of the business and to make sure everything is working in the right way. Like I said at the start, certainly within Britvic, there is not one home for ESG matters. So it happens all the way across the business, which is great, but it does mean it needs even more collaboration. So we do have an ESG committee, which is headed up by our CFO, which brings some governance around it. I think that's really important too. But I think the role of the GC can be to really pull all those pieces together.
Yeah, thank you. Judith, would you like to add to that from your perspective?
Yes, I very much agree that as a legal team, you have that unique perspective right across the business, and we in the legal team particularly spend our time making sure, whilst there is all the committees and all of the right membership of those committees at a very much board and delegated level, when the programs are running, actually it's making sure there's the right stakeholders involved. So from my perspective as a senior lawyer in the team, what we spend our time doing is looking at the more practical aspects of how a program might run. So you're working within the overall framework set by the board and the various committees, but actually you need to have steering groups, you need to have program boards, and membership of those and the right stakeholders involved are really key to the success of the project. So obviously not every lawyer is going to be involved with a board committee. So what we encourage is making sure that the lawyers feel that they can have membership of those delegated steercos and making sure that they're helping to deliver in a broader way. And if we think someone's missing from that at more of the strategic steerco level, we'll try and bring them in. So it's using our position in the company to say, hey, have you consulted with this part of the business? Actually, we need to get them really engaged and involved in this, so that we can all deliver more successfully, whether it be a finance team, a communications team. And one hopes that broadly, most of the time that is always going to be the case. But lawyers can play a key role in getting that membership right and delivering success. And also at working level, having those working conversations with other key stakeholders. It doesn't all need to be formal. It doesn't all need to be with it. When you're working below the framework, those working conversations, making sure that you're talking to someone that needs to be involved on an everyday basis. I think that's something lawyers can really help with from our perspective. So very much a collaborative approach at Severn Trent.
Thanks, Judith. Sheena, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I might just add, it's really interesting to hear what Richard and Judith are saying, because, I can really understand that. So every organisation really has sort of structured ESG in a very different way. And so I think, understand how your organisation is doing that. And if you have any influence or say so, it can change. And ours has morphed, over the last couple of years. And so I think that's one thing to understand. And so I actually do bring ESG together, and we felt like there was a need. So I've been doing it for a couple of years, even though, I'm not a sustainability expert. I know a lot more now than I did about HVAC systems and insulation, but, that's not my forte, but I have had to bring it together. And with that, you have to understand it better as well. And so I do encourage all legal teams to educate themselves. And what Judith just said there about, the ability to talk informally in your organization is so critical. And actually, this is a great time for legal teams to learn from within their organization, because ESG is still high on the agenda. It's still new for a lot of people. Actually, there are a lot of people who, whether you have a director of sustainability or a head of ESG or whoever is in your business, they really also want to teach and learn and sort of get out there and educate everyone in the business. And you'd be surprised at how often and easy it is to say, hey, director of sustainability, what does that mean? What's GRESB stand for? What does it mean to reduce your carbon emissions? What's scope 1, 2, 3? What does it mean? And actually, people are very willing to talk about it at the moment. So I would say, the legal teams to really support this, focus area, understand and educate yourselves, whether it's within the organization informally. And there's so much material out there at the moment as well for, everyone's talking about it. There are webinars coming out of my ears, to talk about ESG from the basics to the complex. So pick one of those up, understand the terminology, and understand how your business is structured sort of responsibilities, and the fact that it can change. So, you know, if you think there's something missing, say so, you know, introduce something different, because there were actually a lot of organizations are still learning and growing in this area. And again, I found as well in our business, people are popping up at the woodwork. You know, they did a bioscience degree and suddenly they know lots about, you know, something that to do with environmental systems or biodiversity. And actually you can get into a bit of chaos because everybody wants to put their tuppence in. Someone in finance now has, you know, views on meadows that we should be planting. But actually you have to create some structure and organization. And hopefully as a GC, you can be part of that, forming the right structures in the business. And, you know, they may change over time.
Thanks, Sheena. Some really interesting points there. And I think that whole piece around, I really like that piece around sort of collaboration. And my experience has certainly been that general counsel and legal teams have got a really good knowledge of who to bring into the conversation and you know, at the centre of that often. So it's been, as we've kind of reviewed our governance processes around ESG, I think working really closely with general counsel and with our risk management teams has been key to that. And you're right, Sheena, there are so many people now that have got these sort of skill sets around different aspects of ESG that are so, you know, brilliant to bring into the conversation. Absolutely. Richard, did you want to add something further to that?
Yeah, sure. It was when we were talking about how we can bring in some structure, and I think it's quite an important point, particularly as the theme of this is Smarter Working Week. It's quite difficult for individuals to go out and try and manage this on an individual basis and to try and make sure everyone's doing the right thing. And one of the key avenues that we found in our business is the approval systems for various things. So again, we're in the privileged position that we always see those and we can control you know, how they're created. And one of the things that's been really useful is Section 172 statements coming in and having more and more importance. And so what we've been able to do at Britvic is actually build Section 172 statements into all of our approvals, which naturally have an ESG focus as well, but we've expanded on that too. And so that's just a way of making sure that whenever anyone comes to making a big decision in the business, you've created a framework there. So they have to go through you know, those requirements, talk about ESG and how it relates to their projects, and that's without you actually having to go out and tell them. So I think that's an important thing as well. Is, you know, you need to go out and give the message verbally, but also try and make it easy for yourself by building the infrastructure around it so it just happens naturally.
It's a brilliant example, Richard. Thank you for sharing that. And I think anything that we can do that kind of embeds ESG across all of the decision making and you know, has that sort of ESG lens on big decisions that we make is really helpful. So that's, yeah, really good example. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so leading on from that, legal teams and general counsel are often at the centre of identifying organisational risk, as we've already heard a little today. So from an ESG perspective, what type of risks should you be aware of, and how can you approach those, I guess, smartly? And I will come to Richard first of all on that. Again, sorry, Richard.
That's okay.
A lot of the questions first. Apologies.
No problem. That's all right. I think for me the key risk is the risk of getting it wrong, and I'd split that into two main things that come to mind. So the consumer risk and also the investor risk. Consumers, as we know, are becoming more and more discerning in their choices. If businesses are not seen in the public eye as doing the right thing, consumers will vote with their money. They'll go and spend their money elsewhere for businesses that are seen to be doing the right thing. And so that is a really important point that actually helps, you know, the legal functions and general counsels get the message across to the rest of the business. You know, this is not just a nice to have anymore, and it's actually going to impact profitability. So that consumer risk is really big. And in a similar vein, I see investor risk as well. So ESG, as was mentioned earlier, is largely an investor-led term, isn't it? And I think that's why it's become such a big thing now. It's been called various different things in the past, but ESG seems to be sticking for now. And lots of lots of businesses, I'm sure, will be in big ESG funds, and investors are now looking at really closely at what companies they want to invest in. And getting that wrong, and coming out of an ESG fund, if you have a major governance issue or something like that, can have huge impact on the share price. And I think that's another thing where you can really get the attention of the business to kind of help drive this message forward. We've had a few within our business, some presentations and training things that we've done with exec and with board. And when you frame it in that way, and you talk about how important this is to share price and profitability, I think that's really what gets it at the top of the agenda. That's the big difference to sort of 5-10 years ago.
Thanks, Richard. Before I come to Sheena, I just want to remind people that they can ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A function. We do have a bit of time at the end, so we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. And so apologies, Sheena, coming to you next.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's interesting because Richard obviously works in a consumer business, whereas I'm in a B2B business. And so I feel that the risks are quite different in some ways. We feel that the ESG risk mostly, well, I feel it, I suppose, on behalf of my business, is that there's a lot of pressure at the moment and a lot of pressure to deliver a lot quite quickly, whereas actually ESG issues are all really long-term issues and long-term improvements in the way we operate and run our businesses and therefore impact our communities, our planet, our people. And so I think there's a risk around doing things too quickly because of the pressures that are demanding that. And that can take many forms. That can take forms in terms of what's your net zero carbon goal? You tell us now. No one asks how you're going to get there, who's going to pay the cost for that? What does that come, what cost does that come as a result of? What about what's your carbon footprint now? What's it going to be next year? And really businesses have very, very different impacts on sort of the environment and people around them. And so one size does not fit all. And a lot of investors and people in the public are sort of expecting this yardstick, which applies across all companies because it helps them measure performance for their own investments. So for me, I think the pressure is a big risk because it means you may be putting out statements, committing to things which aren't actually good for your business in the longer term. You may not be doing them accurately. On the other hand, there's a balance to be struck. So I think ESG has, for me, been a real eye-opener in terms of how people approach what they do want to commit to and put out there. And there is a lot more leeway these days to say that, you're committed to it, you're working towards it, you haven't got it quite right, you're estimating things, there are caveats and assumptions. And that's a very different comfort level to a lawyer's used to, where you verify every number, every word that is sort of put out there and every commitment you make. But actually there is a little bit of room at the moment while the sort of, the landscape is changing and legislation is still forming. What people really want to see is that you are taking it seriously and you're making a commitment. So I think I would say there's a balance between the short-term and the long-term risks, but there's also something you need to watch out for in terms of the balance that is to strike. And you'll see, I've looked at many annual reports of public companies over the last few years. It's incredible. You would have never seen that 10 years ago. I used to write annual reports for my previous business, and you would never see a paragraph going, well, we're doing better. We're looking at these things, but we haven't looked at some things. And you would never see that disclosed in an annual report. But people are expected to be indicating and showing where they're going, what they're doing, even if they're not fully there. So I think for me, those are some things you really have to be wary of as a legal team. Both in accuracy and precision, as well as the flexibility and demands to be saying something about what you're doing.
Yes, really, really good points there, Sheena, particularly around the reporting. That I think, that the different frameworks that are available, and you said you've already made the point, but the expectation of being able to map where you are in terms of the journey, really, I think is becoming increasingly important. So thank you for that. Judith, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, so actually building on Sheena's point there, I agree that the pace to deliver has really increased in recent years. And as the legal team, we very much want to support that pace. what we are also interested in making sure that our board and our directors are very clear on how we're putting it into our existing obligations under our statutory framework. Severn Trent obviously has 2 waste and water utilities within it, and we have to do everything pursuant to that statutory and regulatory framework. So it's making sure, and I think this is where lawyers can really add value, speaking more from a working legal function perspective, that corporate memory and that making sure that we've given the advice. This is how we're going to deliver a green recovery scheme in our in a particular town or city. This is how we're going to do it. This is pursuant to these sections of the Water Industry Act. Everybody later on, 5 years' time even, which sounds a long way away, but actually isn't a long way away, will then be able to put their hand on that and say, this is how we delivered it, and this is the very solid ground on which we were able to do it. I think that corporate memory point for me is really important, and I think the legal team plays, and I think that often businesses look to the legal team to be that corporate memory, and making sure that the advice is presented in a manageable form is really critical, because if you've got that tension between the pace and can I deliver it, versus let's make sure we're entitled to deliver it in this particular way, I think that presenting it in a very manageable way for your senior team is really a critical role that a lawyer can play and help manage the risk for the long term.
Thanks, Judith. Yes, some really good points there. Before we go on to questions, is there anything else, Sheena, Judith, Richard, that you wanted to comment in terms of that last question?
I'd just like to add that I think the panel firms, where legal teams have a appointed panel or any legal firm that they want to use, can also be really supportive towards this. And certainly at Severn Trent, we've encouraged collaboration amongst our firms to help support us in what we want to deliver. So I would say that there's huge knowledge. Someone said earlier, there's perhaps some teams might struggle to say, okay, do I understand this term? Do I understand that? I would encourage legal teams to rely on their panel and to encourage that collaboration amongst the panel to help deliver what the legal team need to deliver.
Thanks, Judith. Okay, so we've had some questions in, so I'll make a start with those, and I'll come to you, Sheena, first of all, if that's okay. So in your organisations, does the overall accountability for managing ESG strategy, delivering the plan, sit with General Counsel, or does it sit elsewhere in the company? And I think it'd be useful to hear from all of you on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And it's a good question. I think that general counsels do take on a lot. It's in our nature. We are general counsel to the company. But ultimately, it depends on your own company structure and how the company has decided to deal with ESG, whether, it's in sort of different pockets throughout the business or whether they have allocated 1 or 2 people who oversee it. I think it's very common to see someone at the exec or board level who has overall responsibility, even if it's not in their title or their sort of day-to-day job, but they are, have responsibility as someone would for customers or risk or audit, in the same way. I think that's becoming more common. And you can see that through the questions you ask or get asked from ESG rating agencies and investors. They like to see somebody with accountability at the exec or board level. So I don't think it necessarily sits the GC. It depends on your company, but clearly a GC has a very, very key role that they can play in it. And it's wise to actually understand and talk about that in your business, like who really is taking accountability for overall, or if not overall, where are the pockets of accountability for these strands of your ESG strategy and who's delivering those strands?
Thank you. Richard, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. One of the things I've seen in this area is not just in our business, but in other businesses I've spoken to as well. I think lots of people on boards want to be the person who's owning ESG. As always, with the board, everyone is sort of fighting for turf in certain areas and wanting to have as much control over certain areas of the business as they can. And ESG now being such a critical part of businesses, it's exactly the same with that. So I think lots of board members would want to own it completely. I think with the general counsel, the G, so governance, is naturally going to sit with the general counsel. It's probably the one that not many people would fight you for, and so there is, I think, always a tendency for the GC to have that. But then for the other aspects, I see the real mix. And what we have at Britvic is actually, as I said at the beginning, it being completely split across the business. There's not really one person on our board or executive team who you would say is completely responsible for ESG, and that goes through all of the different layers of the business. Actually, everybody has accountability, and that's laid out in our company strategy, so this was really clear for everyone. I think it's right that there is some governance to try and pull that together, though. So we do have an ESG committee, which I said before is headed up by our CFO, and that does bring a bit more accountability. But the danger is you don't want everyone else in the business to think, okay, ESG is the thing that committee's doing. It's really important that everyone owns it.
Judith?
I would just echo what Richard's just said. It's split across our business, but obviously our company secretary sets the framework within which the governance is executed. So very much split across, but we play a key role in general counsel and company secretariat to deliver against that framework. So very much spread across our business and under a number of board members and committees delegated from the board.
Thank you. And a really good question that we've had in, which I think comes up quite a lot in the context of ESG. So we've touched on environmental parts of ESG. What do you each do around the social aspect, and how can general counsels help train and increase awareness of their teams? Excuse me. So from my perspective, I think we find that a lot of the reporting and the interest around ESG is for very obvious and the right reasons, is focused around environmental at the moment, and the work that we urgently need to do around climate change. But that does sometimes mean, I think, that there's kind of less focus on social, and I suppose perhaps sometimes in terms of the reporting, less structure around how we measure and report on the social aspects. So Judith, I know you had some really good examples of different projects that you've been involved in, so I don't know if you want to comment on that first of all.
Yes, and if anyone's interested, Severn Trent does publish a number of its initiatives on ESG on its website. So if anybody wants to visit our website and look those up, please do so, to my point earlier about transparency with our customers and stakeholders. So Severn Trent obviously has a very much a social purpose, and we're very committed to supporting reduction of water poverty in our region, and very much committed to training new skills and social mobility in our region. So we do publish all of that on our website as part of our ESG commitments, and we use the term helping people to thrive. How legal gets involved in it is making sure that we're supporting our customer and other teams to deliver against that. So helping to identify vulnerable customers, helping to support on those commitments. So legal plays a more general role in that social aspect. But I would say our company is continuously moving forward with its social responsibility, and very much as part of our last price review, we announced 1% of our profits goes to our communities under a trust. So it's very much something that we're continuously looking at and developing new ideas, but legal will always support all of those initiatives across the piece.
Thanks, Judith. Richard, do you want to comment on that as well?
Thanks, Kate. I think I completely agree with what Julie's just said. I think the only thing I can really add is it just comes back to the role of the legal function in bringing it back to the strategy of the business. So this is a key example where quite often the legal function wouldn't really create that strategy, whereas our role would be to ensure that it is followed through. And one of the things that that we can use to do that is our skills as lawyers. So we are trained to critique things and to go into areas that we don't necessarily understand all the detail of, and get up to speed really quickly and provide some analysis. And so even in areas where we don't necessarily create the strategy, we've got a big role to play in holding people accountable to what they said that they'll do, and actually really getting into it and saying, why are you doing it that way? Do those numbers add up? Talk me through that, and just really challenging and probing the business.
Thanks, Richard. And Sheena, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I might just add something more, I suppose, granular, really, and detailed, which is that social usually falls into two buckets around ESG. One is obviously the external piece around your communities and charitable initiatives, but then there's a piece around the internal employees and their health, well-being, development, learning, and career progression, etc. And so I think there are lots of elements around there where legal gets involved, not just on the contractual point of view, but also in terms of like data. I've come back to that a couple of times, I think, but when you're looking at D&I, which is often sort of sitting in HR or sort of around there, or you're looking at initiatives for your well-being, there's a lot of data you're dealing with. Some of it's very, very sensitive as well. So actually making sure that the business is reaching out to the legal team as well to get guidance on things like data protection and use of data, etc., is really, really important. So as we've all been saying, legal is the foundation of many, many things in the business, and ESG is no different, and nor is social.
Thanks, Sheena. And I'm going to ask you to carry on with that chain of thought, if that's okay, because the final question that I think we've got time for today is around there being so much information, so much data out there, and whether it's difficult for general counsels to try and implement all the different elements of ESG when you are sort of confronted with so much information. Does it lead to us just focusing on certain parts of it, I guess, rather than the whole? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can start off. I'm sure everyone has some thoughts as well to share, but I think that there is a lot, and you do have to grapple with what are you going to pay attention to. And I think that's actually a business responsibility, not necessarily a general counsel's responsibility, because obviously businesses are at the moment choosing which frameworks they're reporting against or aligning themselves with, and that will impact then, throughout the organization in terms of what you're collecting, how you're collecting it, how you then are analysing it and reporting it. And so I think that a GC has a role in understanding what the business is focusing on, and where there is sort of conflict, inconsistency, too much, frankly, to sort of put their hand up and sort of and identify areas which they need to focus on, and actually point out the risks where we think we cannot focus on things, or identifying where things are lower or higher risk, and therefore choosing in an informed way where you're sort of spending your time, and how that risk in profiles is sort of shaped for your company. And so, for example, D&I is an interesting one in particular. It's on the social side, but if you're collecting data, we work across 17 countries. You're not allowed to ask for data, even on a voluntary basis, in relation to certain statistics, which actually in the UK everybody wants to know about, and everyone wants you to report against. So how do you deal with that? You can't do it. You have to understand it, and then I guess understanding what you can and cannot do, the risks you're willing to take around it, the approach you're going to take to it. That is very much a general counsel role, and you end up shaping in some ways what you do in that particular area because of what the laws actually prescribe. And that goes back to what Judith said, at the end of the day, there are laws that we have to pay attention to in implementing our ESG strategy. So that will sometimes define what a legal team has to think about.
Thanks, Sheena. Judith, Richard, we're almost out of time, but any quick thoughts on that you'd like to share?
No, I agree with what Sheena said.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you. Okay. The 45 minutes has gone very quickly, as I thought it might. So as we're almost out of time, I'm going to bring the session to a close and say a huge thank you to our fantastic panel for being so open and sharing your insights and experience about the role that General Counsel can play in implementing a smarter approach to ESG in all of our organisations. It's been a great discussion from my perspective. I've got lots of notes, so lots of takeaways for me. I'm hoping everybody in the audience is the same. A couple of things that I wanted to leave you with today. I suppose from my perspective, that the role of general counsel in ESG seems to go way beyond risk management governance issues, and actually I think extends to advising on wider ethical considerations across the business. So general counsel are often front and center of the discussion around ESG issues, and what I really picked up on in our discussions today is that you are really well placed to identify the key internal and external, sometimes, stakeholders who need to collaborate and be part of the discussion. And my final point is really that I suppose we've picked up on this a couple of times today. Identifying and managing ESG risks can't just be the responsibility of the general counsel team. It has to be something that's part of everybody's job, really, within an organisation, if we're truly going to embed this and make a difference. So having that really good, robust governance structure in place is really important, but also making sure everybody within the organisation understands what we're trying to achieve. So we hope you found the session today useful. Thank you once again to our panel and to everybody who has joined us. I think all that's left for me to do is to say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.